Hi. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone have had a great lunch and ready for the last panel of the day. Well, energy systems are at the heart of our economies, but they also shape social and environmental inequalities. And as we navigate the transitions to a cleaner energy world, the questions of equity, who benefits, who bear the cost, who is left behind, become more urgent than ever. And today, our panel will explore these critical challenges and the pathway to a more just and inclusive energy future. And to guide these discussions, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Emmanuel Taiwu. Emmanuel is a doctoral researcher at University of Toronto, where he investigates equity and justice barrier in climate and energy transitions. Please join me in welcoming Emmanuel and our panelists today.
Thank you, Fran. Good job there. Good afternoon, everyone. I should say you all should salute yourselves for still being here so far, so please give yourselves a hand for still being here. We will be talking about equity in energy, and it's a very timely conversation. The Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Mark Carney, in his victory speech the other day, was talking about how there has to be a plan, to make Canada an energy superpower. I remember those words, right? Energy is important to Canada. And as Canada advances towards a net zero energy future, how do we ensure that no one is left behind? This panel will tackle the critical equity challenges of the energy transition, focusing on those that are most affected, those that are excluded, and those that are at risk. From addressing energy poverty to empowering Indigenous communities, we would explore in this panel today policies, partnerships, plans, strategies, hopefully, with this fantastic panel, to build an inclusive, fair, equitable energy system for all Canadians. We will draw on insights from policymakers here, experts, academics, and join us as we reimagine a transition that balances environmental goals with social justice. I'm pleased to have this very amazing, diverse panel here, and I will introduce from my immediate right, Professor Laura Tozer. Laura Tozer is an assistant professor of environmental studies in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at the University of Toronto. Our research focuses on urban climate governance and equity in the transition to a renewable energy-powered society. She directs the Impact Lab, which is a community-based and policy-engaged research group focused on environmental politics and governance to address climate change. Laura's current research focuses on how to accelerate equitable transitions to zero carbon and resilient cities, particularly related to energy transitions and building decarbonization. She has several interdisciplinary research projects on these topics, including the Youth Climate Action in Toronto project focused on youth engagement, the Just Transitions in Action project focused on community-led climate action in Scarborough, and the Retrofit the Future project on accelerating building decarbonization in Canada. Join me as we welcome Laura with a round of applause there. And I should mention and confess that Laura also doubles as my doctoral advisor here, and she's truly amazing. Not because she is my advisor, but she is amazing. Thank you, Laura, for being here. And next we've got Councillor Dianne Saxe. Dr. Dianne Saxe is an independent Toronto councillor representing Ward 11, University Rosedale. She is one of Canada's most respected environmental and energy lawyers. With decades of experience, she advocates for practical, environmentally sustainable solutions to urban challenges. As Ontario's last Environment Commissioner, Dr. Dianne Saxe served as the independent guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights until the office was abolished. She later served as deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario, authoring its roadmap to net zero. Our expertise spans environmental law, governance, sustainability, and numerous accolades, including a Law Society Medal and an Osgood Hall Law Alumni Gold Key for Lifetime Achievement. That's awesome. Dr. Saxe holds a PhD in law and environmental studies and serves as a senior fellow of Massey College, an adjunct faculty at the University of Toronto's School of the Environment. She hosts 2 podcasts, Saxe and the City and Green Economy Heroes. A lifelong resident of our ward. Oh, we should. Everyone has to know how amazing you are. But thank you so much for coming. A lifelong resident of our ward, where 3 generations of our families were born, Dr. Saxe maintains strong community connections. A veteran for over 50 years, she can often be seen cycling through the ward or enjoying local parks with her grandchildren. Amazing, Dr. Saxe. A round of applause for her. And next we've got Dr. Phil DeLuna. Phil DeLuna is Chief Science and Commercial Officer at Deep Sky, a carbon removals project developer building large-scale infrastructure to reverse climate change. Prior to Deep Sky, Phil led carbon tech at McKinsey & Company, was the youngest ever director at the National Research Council of Canada, and was a finalist in the Carbon X Prize. He's a Governor General gold medal winning scientist, a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada, an adjunct professor of material science and engineering at the University of Toronto, and a Forbes top 30 under 30. Amazing, Phil. I wonder what I've been doing with my life with your bio here. Amazing. Thank you, Phil, for being here.
Thank you.
And last, definitely not the least, we've got Serena Mendizabal. Serena is a Cayuga Wolf Clan Panamanian woman from the 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. Serena is a community-based researcher, grassroots organizer, and environmental advocate, and has worked in climate, environment, and clean energy for almost a decade. Serena's desire to work in climate justice and clean energy comes directly from a community of 6 nations that has long been involved in frontline work, international advocacy, and land protection. Serena is the managing director at Sacred Earth Solar, an Indigenous women-led organization supporting Indigenous communities in implementing climate solutions and healing justice. Sacred Earth Solar is one of the only Indigenous nonprofit implementing renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure through a climate justice approach. Through Sacred Earth Solar, Serena has implemented renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure projects alongside communities across Turtle Island. Thank you, Serena, for your work, and thank you for being here. A round of applause for Serena as well. So that's the official bio. I know you all speak about yourselves in different ways, more amazing ways. So before we go into the first question for this panel on equity and energy transition, we'll just give you a minute each to tell the audience what you do outside of this official bio. So we'll start with you, Serena, and then come this way.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, Scano, Serenity Gauso, Gakononi Consulta, Ochiniga Shoutan, Oswaigon Yirogeno. So it's just custom that I introduce you guys in my language. I'm Serena. I'm Cayuga Wolf Clan from 6 Nations, the Grand River. I came from the res today. It was a beautiful day to come into the city. And yeah, I'm a managing director at Sacred Earth Solar. We're an Indigenous women-led org, as was said. We focus on advancing a just transition away from colonial extractivism. And really, I think we're that bridge between the clean energy sector and climate justice, because that's where I see a major gap. And yeah, I didn't mention, I have my master's in Indigenous health and environment. I focus my research working with communities who are impacted by industries such as pulp and paper mills in being able to gather community health baseline health data that would be able to inform if we should decommission the pulp and paper mill in their community. From there, though, it's, I think for me, we know the issues that we're facing in our communities, and so I wanted to build the solutions. And that's what's brought me to Sacred Earth and to be doing this work for the last 10 years. So thank you. Nyao.
Awesome. Phil, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. So I work at a company called Deep Sky. We're a technology-agnostic project developer in carbon removal. It's a long mouthful, but really we're an oil and gas company in reverse. Oil and gas companies extract carbon from the ground, extract energy from it, and then that carbon goes into the air. We take carbon out of the air using renewable energy, compress and liquefy it, and then put it back where it came from, permanently sequestering it. And the idea here is emissions reduction, unfortunately, is no longer enough. The climate is warming far faster than we expected. We actually have to remove the carbon dioxide that we've already put up there, this blanket that's warming this planet, and that's what my company does and what I do.
Fantastic. Dr. Saxe?
Yes, I have the privilege of being the city councillor for this area, University of Rosedale, best ward in the city. We have many hats in the city, so I sit on city council, community council, infrastructure and environment, the Atmospheric Fund, Toronto Region Conservation Authority, the TTC, Toronto Hydro, the Art Gallery of Ontario, 20 residents associations, 18 BIAs, a community center, an arena, oh yes, and the National Zero Waste Council. So, I ran because of climate. Phil here was one of the people who sort of held my hand into the beginning. What happens when you knock on someone's door, right? Did all that stuff from the very beginning. There are many, so I'm here to be a practical realist about what decisions are actually possible, what resources do we actually have. With all due respect to my academic colleagues, and I suppose I should say that 3 of my immediate family are professors. I do respect enormously the work of academics, but it isn't always rooted in reality of what money we have and what we can do with it and what the hard choices are. So there's an awful lot of stuff that comes to us saying, just do everything. Just make it all happen right now. And that's not possible. City government, we have 9 cents out of every tax dollar. We are primarily responsible for infrastructure. We cannot fill all the holes left by destructive provincial governments like the one we have. So when people say you must do this and this and this and this, the first question is, okay, with what? And our life consists almost entirely of hard choices. There are no magic wands. There's no tree with money on it. We have very limited resources. We have enormous demands. We're in tough times, and we have tough choices, and that's what I do to the best of my ability every day.
Thank you. Laura, please.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to listen today. As Manuel mentioned, I'm a professor here at U of T, and I do research alongside government and not-for-profit and community partners. So I have research projects that are with municipal governments, working with them to help understand as best we can how to take more effective climate action across the country, especially in mitigation, greenhouse gas emission reduction. How can we make some of those trade-offs? What are some of the decisions that need to be made? What can we help do to support those decisions? But I also do work on energy systems. I'm a social scientist, so it means I study the social, cultural, political dynamics of creating this systemic change that we need for energy. We have a lot of focus on the technologies, less on how we change any of those technologies. So this is the area that I work in, trying to understand the governance, the social momentum, how we intervene in policies and make new ones in ways that build momentum towards sustainable energy systems.
Awesome. Thank you all. This is looking interesting already, and I hope that the audience would agree. Before we dive into matters of equity, for those who probably do not get a sense of why should equity or why should the energy transition matter to Canada or to Canadians, can you help the audience understand why should Canada or Canadians care about the energy transition before we go into understanding the equity dimensions of the energy transition? Serena, you want to go first there?
Yeah, so we keep talking about the ongoing climate crisis that it's bound to come, but to break it to you, we are actually in it right now. And Canada is the second highest GHG emissions, has the second highest GHG emissions per capita out of any country in the world. We also are warming twice as fast as any other countries. And it's okay, statistics sound fun. We can listen to that and we can go, okay, yes, this makes sense. But we're actually living it now. And when I think about this, it's not even just Indigenous peoples living it, it's everyone living climate change. The city beside our community in 2018, after the winter, had a massive flood, evacuated 2,000 people. And so we are quite literally having to deal with, one, the economic fallout, but also the health and well-being of our community members. And so what is directly tied to the climate crisis in Canada? Our fossil fuel industry. And what does that mean? That we need to transition now. And so when I think about this, it's directly tied. And I'll get more into it, but it comes down to the health and well-being of our people. And that's why the energy transition matters. And I won't get into the equity, I can get into that next. But it's gonna affect everyone, and I think this will be the one issue that does impact everyone, because right now there is disproportionate effects of the climate crisis, but of also health crises and social work and all of these different avenues. But this is where we are gonna align all on one thing, and everyone, even the most rich people, as we're seeing in the LA wildfires, will be impacted. So how can we work together? And that's by implementing a just transition.
Yeah, thank you. Phil, you want to go?
Yeah, and I agree with absolutely everything that Serena just said. The energy transition, and especially in the Canadian context, is necessary not only to deal with the climate crisis, but also the coming economic crisis. And it's all interconnected and intertwined. Climate touches everything, whether that's human health and populations, and when we think about pandemics and the rise of pandemics over time because of the population centers and humans entering places where wildlife are, is an example. When we think of immigration because of climate crises in parts of the world where they're not able to have enough water or food, or agricultural collapse is happening in those regions. The horrible part of it is that climate change is not a local problem. It's a problem we all share internationally, and those who are the least equipped to deal with the fallout are the ones who are most impacted. We are a rich nation, and we can adapt because we have the money to do it. We're not doing it well enough, and we'll talk about equity in a minute. And there are certainly parts of our society that are better positioned than others. In fact, the very few in comparison to the majority. But when we think about why this matters so much, and to the point that was made earlier, our economy is highly dependent on natural resource extraction. And if we don't transition away from that economy, then there's going to be a huge amount of societal upheaval that we're already starting to see, that you could argue is a large cause of the polarization between sort of East and West Canada that we're seeing right now, the Wexit movement that we saw a couple of years ago. Ultimately, it all boils down to, I think, people, and people feeling vulnerable about what their future is, the security of their livelihoods, and that climate impacts everyone in different ways, but we just have to be mindful that it's impacting everyone.
Absolutely. Councillor?
Well, on this, of course, fundamentally we agree. Climate change, climate chaos, climate weirding is a threat multiplier. Whatever you care about, climate chaos makes it worse. You care about hunger, climate chaos makes it worse. You care about war, climate chaos makes it worse. You care about health, climate chaos makes it worse. You care about inequality, climate chaos makes it worse. And this is not a future problem, it's a current problem. Now, almost everybody in this room, I think, is younger than me. It will matter more to you. It will dominate the lives of today's young people, which is why I ran for politics. It is absolutely going to dominate all of our choices. Anything that we think is hard now, and believe me, I think many, many things are hard now, they are going to be much harder. And we see the impacts everywhere, and we know that it's always hardest on the most vulnerable. So the disconnect between who emits and who suffers is large and growing, and the worse we let climate chaos get, the bigger that gap will be. So this is the key thing I want you to understand, is that the faster we make the energy transition happen, the better off almost everyone will be. The slower we let this transition drag, the more most people will suffer, and the most vulnerable will suffer the most. And we see it already in food prices. Who thinks that Galen Weston cares how much his grocery bill is? Who thinks that Doug Ford cares how much his grocery bill is? He doesn't give a damn. I'm sure he doesn't know what it is. It's irrelevant to him. It's irrelevant to him what his insurance bill is. It's irrelevant to him whether he can get insurance, because he can. He's not living in a basement apartment that might flood. He's not living in a basement apartment that might flood without insurance. He's not living in the top floor of an old building with no air conditioning that becomes a sauna in the summer so people can't sleep. The rich don't have the same vulnerabilities. And so climate chaos magnifies inequality, slowing climate chaos, reducing climate pollution, accelerating the transition is the single most important thing we can do for equity, and we're not doing it. So Phil is doing wonderful work on sequestration, pulling back out what we've already done. He said reducing emissions isn't enough. We're not reducing emissions. Emissions are still larger every year than the year before. We're falling further behind every year. The problem that we're leaving for you young people is getting worse by the minute. And that will make inequality enormously worse.
Yeah, and I'm glad there are lots of young people in this room, so hopefully we're taking notes, including myself. But Laura, your thoughts on why does the energy transition matter?
I can't say anything better than my panelists here about the energy transition not being optional. We're not up here debating whether we should do it. No, it's not optional. The energy transition has to happen for any kind of climate-safe future. And the actual content of the energy transition, we've talked about it too across the panel, but we're really talking about eliminating fossil fuels. Whether we're talking about what powers our electricity, what's behind running our food systems, what transports us around, it's eliminating fossil fuels from our energy system that's at the core of the energy transition. It's not the only thing. It's not the only thing we care about our energy system. We care about many other things. It's reliability, it's affordability, other aspects of sustainability. We're going to spend the rest of this time talking about equity. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the energy transition is about eliminating fossil fuels. The other thing I want to kind of bring to the forefront here at the beginning is about all these seeds of acceleration of the energy transition that we can see. We're not seeing nearly enough in greenhouse gas emission reduction, but we can see the drastically dropping prices for renewable energy, the huge expansions of renewable energy infrastructure, the amazing breakthroughs in battery technologies, the rising share of cars that are EVs. There are so many. I've got to cut myself off so that I don't spend the whole time giving examples. We can see it happening and we can see it working, and so the conversation is about doubling down on all those efforts. How can we go much faster? But it's not just about adding the new things, it's about getting rid of the old. It's about shutting down the fossil fuels. It's about a managed decline of the fossil fuel entrenched industries so that energy transition has both those components, both of which have a huge role to play in Canada.
Awesome. Thank you. Now that we've sort of started unpacking why the energy transition should matter to Canada and to Canadians, how do we see the energy transition playing out in Canada so far? At the moment, how is that playing out? How equitable is that at the moment? Before we go into why do we think it's equitable or not, what factors are responsible for that, let's just begin to, sort of unravel how the energy transition is playing out. We understand that it's important. How is it playing out so far? How equitable is that? Laura, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, I'll pick up on what I was just saying on the acceleration of energy transition. We can see some of those examples were home here in Canada, and I also have examples from internationally. And so these are things like the share of EVs. I think it's hit something like 15% of new cars or something. Obviously not as much as we need, but still you can see the leaps that are happening year to year in Canada and some of those things. You can also see the huge investments that are being made in Canada on batteries that are part of our electricity system. Not small batteries, but big ones that are part of making a renewable energy powered, 100% renewable energy powered electricity system work. We can see things that are closer to your home. I cut my gas line to Enbridge a couple years ago to put a heat pump in instead so that my home no longer has any fossil fuels. Now, I'm giving general examples, but the actual accessibility of all of these solutions very significantly across the country, within the city, depending on many different dimensions that are driving equity. So, for example, a lot of the tools that we've been using to try to increase electric vehicles for people still depend on you buying an electric vehicle, which they're pretty expensive, right? And so our transportation, we still need to do a lot more in the public transportation system and electrifying it. Lots happening on this. We can see investments even here in Toronto, but continuing to do that across the country, actually doing those high-speed trains that we hear about every, whatever it is, 10 years, and hope that they actually come into play. I think that those kinds of things, we see announcements about those across the country, but we see a lot of unevenness in access to these modern energy solutions. Because people have uneven access to the energy system right now, even before the energy transition. We have households that are living in energy poverty. Even up to 30% of households in some provinces are living in energy poverty. So the energy transition layers on top of these existing inequities across Canada and really shapes who has access to what kind of energy solutions as we make this transition.
Thank you. Councillor, how do you think the energy transition is playing out? How equitable do you think it is so far in Canada?
Well, I start where I began. Anything that gets us off fossil fuels is for the benefit of particularly the most vulnerable. But it's absolutely true that most of the steps that individuals can take require long-term investment and a long-term payback. So if you put in a heat pump, you've got a much higher upfront cost than you do if you put in a gas furnace. It pays back over time, but you have to have the money up front. Well, first of all, you have to have a place where you're responsible for the furnace, and most low-income people do not. Most low-income people are tenants, and most low-income people are tenants in older buildings, which tend to be badly repaired, inefficient, leaky, and they don't have the control over the building or the money to upgrade it. So they're left suffering the worst of the weather, being cold in the winter, baking in the summer, unable to sleep, and so on. But even if you have a home or have control over a home, do you have the money to invest in electric infrastructure, which saves a great deal over time, is better for your health, is better for other things, but requires you to be able to put up with a payback period of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And low-income people, in many cases, cannot do that. They can't access the money up front because they don't have the money. They don't qualify for credit. They don't qualify for low-income credit. And they can't take a long-term point of view if they don't know how to pay the rent at the end of the month or the food at the end of the day. So we have a whole, fundamentally, the reason for the inequity is that low-income people don't have money. And that plays out 100 different ways. Now, why do low-income people have so little money in the face of these problems? Well, that's primarily the deliberate decisions of the Conservative governments we have, starting with Mike Harris. Some of you don't remember Mike Harris, but okay, well, some do. But, he fundamentally changed the rules in Ontario, dramatically increased the share of wealth going to the wealthy, dramatically reduced support for the poor, and that was doubled down on by Doug Ford, which is why we have deliberate decisions by Conservative governments over and over again to keep poor people in generational poverty, and that's why minimum wage, ODSP, and Ontario Works are at levels that no one can live on in the City of Toronto. Those are deliberate provincial government decisions. And the result is you have, you add to that the destruction that Trump is doing to the rule-based order, international trade, our economy, and so on, is that, plus all the climate damage to food systems, supply chains, and so on. So the cost of living is going up fast, and low-income people are not getting and don't have access to increases in income to make up for that. So they can't even stay even, much less making investments in the future. This is fundamentally an economic problem, and it results from deliberate decisions of the right.
We'll come back to the why, the factors that are responsible for these inequities that we see. And you've started to get at some of those, factors like the economics and the politics. But we will save that for later. Thank you. I know you've got much you want to say on that. But let's hear from Phil, please. how equitable is the energy transition in Canada so far to you?
Yeah, I mean, just the first answer, the first piece, which is how are we doing? We're doing okay, I think is probably the answer, right? We could be doing a lot better. Yes, there's EV adoption is increasing, but if you look at like jurisdictions in Norway where for the first time, I think it was last year, the sale of electric vehicles was actually greater than the sale of fossil fuel vehicles, and they're above 50% of the total vehicles on the road now are electric. A lot of people said, oh, electric vehicles aren't going to work in Canada because it's cold and batteries are not going to be good. Norway is a cold country. It works there. They're fine, and they're doing great. And they're really leveraging the hydroelectricity power that's baseload, that's clean, and are able to do that. But this speaks to something I think that Canada doesn't do well of or hasn't done well of in the past decade, or maybe even more, is investing in the things that matter to build for the future. And what I mean by that is, right now you see a lot, especially in private corporations and in private investments, a conservatism. People don't want to invest capital into the thing that is coming next. They don't want to renew their assets to be low carbon. They don't want to invest in sustainable solutions. They just want to make the thing that has been working for however long last longer. And there's a lack of ambition of capitalizing on the opportunity on the sustainable and transition, on the energy transition. And what that means is that we're getting left behind by other jurisdictions that recognize that and want to actually lean into renewables, lean into energy storage, lean into electric vehicles, and the list goes on and on and on. I mean, the fact that in Alberta, for example, it's very difficult to build renewables, and there's a huge amount of political and permitting red tape in that province to build renewables. That shouldn't be the case. At the same time, though, the permitting and that red tape exists everywhere. And one of the big reasons why we're not, I believe, advancing on energy transition fast enough is because there isn't enough certainty, political certainty and policy certainty that people feel that they have confidence to invest, that they want to put that capital in changing things. If one provincial government can say solar is great and the next cancel everything, then that's a huge amount of waste. If one government can have a cap and trade program and the other repeal it, that creates a huge amount of uncertainty. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful of, maybe to put it into a new looking forward, is that for the first time in a very long time, in this very specific and terrifying current geopolitical climate, I've never felt as much Canadian unity and focus on how can we actually do something that builds this nation better and reduces the reliance on the United States. And if there's one silver lining on this, maybe it's that we can lean into the energy transition and accelerate it and make the real investments that need to happen and reduce the permitting barriers and the red tape so that we can capitalize on this moment and slingshot past our southern neighbors who right now are a mess.
Thank you, Phil. You touched on economics there too, and the lack of interest in investing. But maybe we can get some community perspectives from Serena. What does energy transition look like to you in Canada so far? Do you think it's equitable? Can we begin to talk about those that are actually vulnerable, at risk, as far as this transition is concerned?
Yeah, so I'll start with what are my thoughts on the current trajectory of Canada's transition. And I think there's this major focus on net zero. And I'll be honest, I really don't like the term net zero. I want real zero, because Indigenous communities are still, when we reach net zero, Indigenous communities will still be facing the impact of industry on our homelands. We will still have our languages impacted, we will still have our health impacted, we will still have our lands and territories impacted, as we have seen for hundreds of years. And so what I think is we're trying to reach this goal of net zero, we're trying to defer from economic fallout, but Indigenous peoples have long been experiencing what we are all about to experience with the climate crisis. And so when I do think about Canada's energy transition, I think it is one filled with a plethora of non-consensual false solutions. And I won't say that's all of it, because right now Indigenous peoples are partners or beneficiaries of 20% of Canada's electricity generation, mostly renewable energy. And with that being said, outside of utilities, Indigenous peoples in this country are the largest asset owners of renewable energy. So we literally are leading the transition in this country. And so it just speaks for itself. But when I think about false solutions and I think about what's happening outside of Indigenous peoples and our transition we're leading, I think about these false solutions, and I think about mega hydroelectric dams that are creating methane from the floods, that are also creating mercury in our fish so we can't eat. I think about the nuclear power plants that are in Ontario gaining at a new level of expansion. And when I talk to my relatives from northern Saskatchewan, they are seeing it literally in their meat, the impacts of uranium mining. I also think of hydrogen, and right now, it's gray hydrogen. Like, what is green hydrogen at this point? And so we're literally the fossil fuel industry. We're talking about hydrogen, but we're still reliant on the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not an expert in some of these next things I'm gonna say, but I think with Canada's current plans towards net zero, there's this large emphasis on natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and the focus being framed actually as a transition fuel. So it's clearly so deliberately tied to the transition that we're seeing with this transition fuel. And we're seeing the exports as a way to help other countries reduce their emissions, which is being heavily subsidized by provincial and federal government. But in actuality, it is creating methane, which is 85 times more potent than CO2. It is creating fracking, which is depleting fresh water sources as well as contaminating groundwater, which is impacting our biodiversity, our lands, our waters, like all of it. And it's a long-term commitment. Like, these plants are 30 to 50 years, and if we're going to be reaching net zero, we're not going to reach it because we're still going to be locked into these projects with our infrastructure. I also think about carbon capture too, and the use of it right now, and how we're having significant funding going into the oil and gas industry to clean up their operations instead of just strictly phasing out. And it's being seen as a way to decarbonize heavy industry, which I get, cement, oil and gas, steel, and Canada's investing in it. It's investing heavily, and it's actually a key part of the Pathways Alliance emissions reduction plan for the tar sands, which is quite literally one of the largest industrial projects in the world that has significant impact. It's actually where Sacred or Solar, my organization, comes from, because we faced, our founder faced the Rainbow oil spill at the time. It was the largest oil spill in Canada. And it literally, her family could not breathe. Their eyes were burning. And so I think about how carbon capture will be used for enhanced oil recovery. And I think about, okay, are we using carbon capture, and are these fossil fuel industries going to be taking advantage of it to just produce more fossil fuels? Because at the end of the day, to produce more fossil fuels, we will need carbon capture. And that is what these industries are riding on. And so when I think about, and I hear this, and I think about this, and I'm connected with communities across the country, it comes to my mind that Canada's energy transition is not that equitable right now. And as those burdening the brunt of environmental degradation and then burdening the subsequent impacts of climate change are not being prioritized, but instead they're being arrested for protecting our lands and waters from these industries, as these solutions being put forth through the energy transition are really just prioritizing business as usual in the continued production of the oil and gas industry. And last night, the Wet'suwet'en land defenders actually came into my community to build, we've been building solidarity and relationships. They were fighting from the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which actually had $10.5 billion more than was invested, and I'm pretty sure Canada invested 60%. So this is the transition that's actually happening. And when we're talking about Canada's energy transition, it was at the time the Coastal GasLink pipeline was the largest investment in Canadian history of an infrastructure project. And Justin Trudeau was so happy he had to say it twice. And there was literally people being arrested because they literally have clean drinking water. They can drink from their river, which is something I've never been able to do on my homelands. And they were just trying to protect that. And so I just think Canada's energy transition talks equity, but prioritizes industry over people. And a true shift, true justice, means shifting power and not just our energy sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. We will get to prioritizing equity. We should open it to the audience right now. We've talked about those that are vulnerable, low-income people, renters, Indigenous communities. But where do we go from here? Hopefully, there are members of the audience who will be asking questions that not just in that direction. There's somebody over there. The mic, please.
Is this working? Oh, cool. So it seems like the issue to create the legitimizing discourse we need to actually shift the narrative and get things done at the Indigenous context is just the fact that there's not enough data at each particular Indigenous population. So like it's analyzed as a group. Like the Métis, First Nations, Inuit, like we don't have enough data on each specific group to enact policy changes at like a sort of granular level to enact the change. So if there is more data, it needs to be injected.
So, anyone else?
Oh yeah, and also in regards to like the energy issue, we have a ton of uranium that can be like converted to plutonium, and we could power this country like for like 30 years. So why aren't we using nuclear energy? It's crazy that we're not.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Thank you to all the panelists for your presentations. I wanted to ask you, when you talk about the transition of Canada's economy, I'm wondering, transition from what to what? What I mean by that is that you mentioned, for example, the example of Norway, and that's a country that has had a very accelerated move towards decarbonizing its population's consumption of hydrocarbons. At the same time, though, it has massively expanded the export of oil and gas to other jurisdictions. In Canada, both our new Prime Minister and our current Leader of the Opposition have said that they agree that there should be less consumption of oil and gas domestically, but they also agree that the federal government should invest billions of dollars into expanding the export of oil and gas. So my question to you is, when you talk about transitioning away from an oil and gas industry, do you mean just our consumption as a society, or do you mean also our export of oil and gas? And if the latter, will that really make a difference if the people who are buying our oil and gas can just shift to other countries that have not scaled back their industries?
Thank you. Good question there. Anyone else? We'll take one more and then we'll come back for another round of questions.
Just a related question on the one that has just been put. But the panel so far has talked eloquently about equity and the impacts on the poor, Indigenous communities, and so on. But a related question is, we haven't talked about regional equity. And when you're talking about an energy transition, what happens to the provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan who are dependent on that particular industry? What is in it for them in this transition? And how do we make it at all palatable? In this country, you can't condemn any region to the garbage pail.
Good question there. Panelists, you've heard the questions. There's one on data. I'll let you decide which one you want to go for. On data, another one on why don't we even consider nuclear? As we talk about equity, there's a question on expansion of oil and gas in some countries like Norway that a number of us cited, and also the question there on regional equity. Is it equitable if provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, that have got these resources do not use them? Who wants to start? Laura, you got us to share, and
Sure.
then we'll go to Councillor.
Sure, I can kick us off, yeah. Let me jump around a little bit. So first of all, thank you for the question, from what to what. It's never made clear enough that both things have to, both forms of fossil fuel use have to be eliminated. So in terms of the fossil fuel use that we use here domestically and our entire production and export industry, both things have to go. There's no succeeding on climate without doing both of those things as fast as we possibly can. There's a lot of dancing around that fact in Canada because we have so much fossil fuel industry, entrenchment, and honestly corruption in the country. And so that we dance around that fundamental fact that both have to go. Now, you mentioned Canada is in the context of the world. Obviously, us succeeding on climate depends on energy transition, not just in Canada, but in other places too. And so the same energy transition has to be happening globally. It's a very well-polished talking point of the fossil fuel industry that they are simply responding to demand. It doesn't matter where it's from. If you don't buy it from me, it will just be bought elsewhere. It's a talking point that's meant to prop up the fossil fuel industry. And we have lots of tools that can lead to a managed decline, both domestically and internationally. Nuclear energy is not the solution. Nuclear energy is the most expensive energy choice we have and takes twice as long as any of our other options. It's amazing how much propaganda there is about nuclear energy, so that everybody, every single time I talk about energy transition, someone says, why on earth has no one ever? It gets tons of money, tons of time. It's not part of a solution for, even if, all I gave you was timing and economic reasons, never mind the waste, the environmental injustice of who has to live with that waste, and so on and so on. But maybe I'll stop with those two and let the others.
Yeah, those are good ones there. Councillor, you want to touch on any of this, whether it's data or maybe even the regional equity piece, or whichever of the question strikes you the most?
Well, of course, I have things to say on all of them. I mean, with my current hat, I sit at Toronto City Council, so I think about Toronto and not Canada-wide. As Commissioner, of course, when I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, I looked across Ontario. I don't think data is going to change policy choices. We don't have the economy we have because we're lacking data. We have the economy we have because of where the money comes from and where the power is. So, I mean, certainly collecting data is great and useful, but I think that there is, and we need data to do many things better, but this idea that if only we knew more, of course it would change. It's a little bit like the idea that people like me used to have, that if we only wrote another really good report, everybody would see the light. I wrote 17 really, really good reports. They're still the last word on everything I wrote about it, and it didn't change a goddamn thing. Well, that's not true. We stopped shooting a certain kind of turtle. So there you go. We did one thing. But by and large, this is a question of power and money. I think your question is very fair. Like, what is the change to? And the short answer is we don't really know. We know that fossil fuel, well, okay, I want to go back a bit about fossil fuels. I just want to remind everybody that there's three major categories of fossil fuels: coal, oil, and gas. They all do damage, but in order of damage, coal is the worst, oil is not as bad as coal most of the time, and gas is not as bad as oil most of the time. There are exceptions having to do with fracking, various other things. But and so if you look at Alberta was way ahead of schedule in getting all the coal out of its power generation. And that is a huge win. And Ontario, again, some of you are old enough to remember what the air looked like in Toronto in 2003. Anybody remember how many smog alerts we had in Toronto in 2005? Anybody? Yeah? 53. Do you know anybody who has asthma? My late husband had asthma. It was brutal, yes, okay. Brutally difficult times. Buildings were black, laundry was black, infrastructure was deteriorating, lungs are being contaminated everywhere, cancer was being seeded everywhere, and that was from burning coal. How many smog alert days do we get now? 0. Because we phased out coal, and because a lot of the US companies phased out coal. And for those of you who are interested, the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, the municipal pension plan, has funded Duke Energy getting off coal. So we have made real progress in ways that matter to climate, to health, to the day-to-day livability of the city. If you look around and you look at the old City Hall and how beautiful it is, it was invisible most of my life because it was coated with soot. You couldn't see any of the beauty of that building. That came from coal, and also from vehicle emissions, which are still bad, but not as bad as they were. So the first thing is to get rid of coal around the world as much as possible, and there has been some real success on that. And honestly, having the oil industry attack the coal industry has been useful. Moving away from oil to gas, which is, I certainly agree that gas is not clean. And fracked gas especially is not clean, and we're being sold a bill of goods. And let me say, every time you say natural gas, you know that you have been sucked in by the industry. There is nothing natural about it. It is as natural as arsenic and more harmful. So I don't use that term anymore. That is just marketing. But still, getting off oil to gas is in most cases better, at least for local air quality. So what does the new economy look like? I don't know. But we know that the first thing we have to, and there's lots of things we could talk about. The first thing we have to do is reduce methane. Fast acting, easy to reduce. The methane emissions that we have right now are, in many cases, deliberately high. When I was commissioner, I looked at the situation in Alberta. Anybody want to guess how many deliberate methane emission points they had in Alberta 5 years ago? 400,000. 400,000 places where the oil and gas industry had deliberately designed its equipment to release methane every time they did this or that. It's all unnecessary, it's all highly polluting, it's bad for air quality, it's bad for climate. The fastest response we can get is by cutting methane. That's the first thing. And then the second thing we need to be doing, there's a number of, it's not just fossil fuels, though it is also fossil fuels. And if you're really interested in good options, look at drawdown. Drawdown is one of the, is there anybody here who has never looked at the drawdown website? Okay, go home and look at the drawdown website. It's one of the best pieces of work in the world at the most cost-effective and the most effective ways of dealing with the climate crisis, in many ways that also looks at equity. So refrigerants were their number one, but also educating girls. One of the top things, I think 8 out of the top 20 were related to food. There's huge opportunities to achieve both equity and climate reductions. There's lots of research for it. We're doing some of the things. There's a lot more to do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor, for those thoughts. Phil, do you want to touch on, this is probably not your area, but I'm conscious that we're not addressing that regional piece that much. Councillor, you talked about Alberta and some of the progress they've made on coal. But how about the oil and gas? What happens to them and some of these resources that they've got? How equitable is that?
Can I have one more minute with that? Okay.
1 minute.
All right. One other website you should all go to, Iron and Earth.
Yeah.
Iron and Earth. It's a organization set up by the oil patch workers showing how their skills can be directly translated to renewable energy and that they want to do it.
Nice. Yeah, so the sort of similar to the managed decline you talked about there, Laura. So skills transition, that could be an option. Phil, any of these ones you want to talk about? Data, expansion of...
Yeah, actually, I'll talk about the regional equity piece because I completely agree with the question. I grew up in Windsor. I grew up in a city that had an industry shut down in the 2008 financial crisis. My dad was an auto worker in the Ford plant. He got laid off. He lost his job. I know exactly what it's like to live in a place that is dependent on one industry and what happens when that industry goes away and the economic havoc that has on families and the insecurity, instability it causes. I know it. And I see that exact same thing happening and will continue to happen in the fossil fuel industry in places like in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, and in the West. And that's why it is so incumbent upon us to find a clean energy destination for that industry to go to. And we talked about the question on Norway, on reducing consumption at home, but then increasing export elsewhere. We absolutely have to do both. But by decreasing consumption at home, by creating more sustainable ways to make food, to move people around, to heat our homes. That is actually a blueprint for the rest of the world as well. It's unrealistic and also unfair to expect the developing economy to bear the burden of new technology and of all of this transition when us as the developed economy have had decades and a century worth of economic benefit because of that, because of polluting into the atmosphere. So we have a moral imperative to actually decarbonize as quickly as possible, get ourselves off of fossil fuels locally as much as possible, and then export clean energy technologies, solutions, sustainability practices, businesses, products that are net zero or green as much as possible. And that will create economic opportunity, and that is what will allow these industries and these communities to thrive. And I'll talk about Windsor again. Electric vehicles and battery production, there are new electric vehicle and battery production plants that are being retrofitted in Windsor, and it's creating a huge opportunity for local job creation and growth for a community where a decade ago people were wondering what their future was going to be and which plant was going to close down next. Now it's, there's a potential that we can revitalize this area, this section, and be a supplier of electric vehicles for the energy transition. How do we think about that in other regions in North America? And I also want to give a shout out to Iron and Earth, which is a fantastic nonprofit organization, which is all about skills training, and literally it lives that mandate of trying to find where people transition to, from what to where. We just have to find a way to do it without leaving anyone behind.
Fantastic. Serena, do you want to talk a bit about that data point and whether data is more data, whether that's the solution to get us to equity for, say, and it's fine if that's not what you want to talk about, but rather than unpack challenges and barriers, I want us to begin to dive into the solutions. Where do we go from here? For underserved communities, for Indigenous communities, other minority ethnic communities across Canada that are sort of bearing the brunt of the transition in Canada. Where do we go from here to get those communities to equity? If you want to start with that one. Is it data or something else?
Yeah, and I do appreciate what you were saying about data. As I said, I came in through statistics within my master's, and I just wanted to throw it in there. We only have enough data to analyze Indigenous populations as sort of combined group, monoliths. Yeah, we don't have the capacity. That's why I did the work I do, because we literally had no baseline health data in the community we were working in. We had accelerated rates of cancer, and so we're let's do this ourselves. So I completely understand what you're saying, but I have to agree with counselors of people are doing the research and people are doing it, and it's just not enough, because I think we're actually coming apathetic to the climate crisis and to the current energy mix and diversification we're seeing. So when I think about solutions, and I appreciate all of your guys' questions. And also there's no Indigenous legislature at all, even if it's put on policy. And I just wanted to throw this out there. I also noticed that all the policies that are being constructed currently related to hydro, there's really no Indigenous input at the implementation of those policies.
Okay, we have to see if other people have got thoughts, but we appreciate your question there. Serena, do you want to go ahead? On this solution?
No, and I hear someone in the crowd saying that's. I would say this is where it comes down to. It comes down to self-determination. And so we might be including within, give the Sustainable Jobs Act, for example, that is really nice language, but it doesn't have the timelines or the necessary action items in place to actually be effective at this point. And within the advisory council of that Sustainable Jobs Act, we have literally one First Nations, one Métis, and one Inuit seat. We make up 5% of the population, all of us Indigenous peoples, and 3 people are supposed to represent who we are. And so I do think there is strides, but I don't think it's enough, because it comes back to self-determination. And I don't want to seat at your table. I want to lead in my own governance system. And so coming back to your question, because I think there was a lot of good questions, and it kind of relates as how can we, like, what are solutions in my brain? And I think governments, utilities, regulators, foundations, educational institutions, one, need to recognize and uphold Indigenous sovereignty. That means implementing UNDRIP within all climate and energy decision making. That means actually like land back, so transferring control of lands, including jurisdictional authority and revenue sharing, and also supporting Indigenous-led clean energy projects and not just allowing us to be participation. I didn't get to touch on my community, but we have the biggest clean energy portfolio out of any First Nation in the country. But we only have equity ownership 100% in one project, and we have 1,600 megawatts of clean energy within that we have relationship with or a beneficiary of. But it's not all coming back to us, it's actually going to the greater province. And so that would be one thing I would think. The next one I would see is to invest in community workers, and I think the just transition actually comes from the labor movement, and it means that no one is getting left behind, and that means that people within industry, within the oil and gas sector, and I think about how are we actually redirecting everything that we're subsidizing within the fossil fuel industry into the capacity building of both Indigenous communities, but also workers who have transferable skills within the trades that would be really beneficial. Like, we need electricians, we need carpenters, we need everyone. And then I guess the last thing too would be to democratize energy governance. So let's reform utilities and energy regulators, because we don't necessarily have that much of a seat at the table. I'm pretty sure in the Canadian Energy Regulator, like, there might be 2 Indigenous people on the board. How are those 2 people really representing us? And so how are we including more perspectives from those on the front lines within the actual constitutions of our energy governance? And so, yeah, that's just some thoughts on my end, and could definitely talk more, but I'll
Absolutely. We've got 2 minutes 42 seconds left, but I would like to hear final thoughts from other members of this panel on what's the way forward, what solutions can we begin to bring to the table to get us to equity on, in Canada's energy transition. Laura, any thoughts there?
Oh, okay, the 30-second version.
Yeah.
Okay, so one point is to think about who's left holding the bag with fossil fuels. As those industries move out of Alberta, the capital leaves, the workers actually lived elsewhere all along. The Indigenous peoples whose land that is are left with the tailings pond and the industries that they were forced to build around the fossil fuel industry. So thinking about the way forward and who needs a just transition, in who's left holding the bag on fossil fuels. The second point is who bears the harms of the new energy system. Here we have to think about who's impacted by things like mining for some of the minerals that we need, and how we can address the environmental injustices in that. But the actual takeaway, I would line it up this way, because my actual takeaway is who benefits from these modern energy solutions, who has a comfortable home that's heated with healthy, not poisoning gas, that's warm enough, that's cool enough, that lives that right to be cool, who has access to clean transportation, who has access to healthy air, who is, there's lots of ways forward on doing that, and one of them for housing is about multiple levels of government getting back into the business of providing quality, affordable housing, which is, I know you talked about that already and is a huge topic to end on, but that's what I'd like to live on.
With energy.
Climate-safe homes.
Absolutely. Councillor, in 30 seconds, what ways can we get to energy equity?
We can't do this in 30 seconds.
I know.
This is going to be late, so you just, relax. My top takeaway is if we care about inequality, and I presume all of you do, then the top priority should be accelerating the energy transition, because not accelerating it is the biggest threat to equality. The second thing is, if we look at, now I have to put my council hat back on, what's the city government's primary job? Our income support is not our job. We don't have the money for it, we're not financed for it, it's not our job. Our number one job is to provide infrastructure. And we are doing that. That's one of the things that Sydney over there from my office and I are working on all the time, is the infrastructure that allows everyone to live well with little or no fossil fuels. And that includes the TTC. It includes bike share. It includes bike lanes. It includes Toronto Hydro. It includes public parks and pools and all the other things that the city provides. Anything that impoverishes the city punishes the poor the most. Anything that improves public space improves the quality of life for all of us and particularly benefits the poor. Our secondary job is to inspire and to pilot the transition. We do that through the through the Atmospheric Fund, enormous set of programs worth looking at if you haven't, and the higher green standards that we have for Toronto buildings, so that again, we're demonstrating what clean buildings look like. We're building clean buildings. We're allowing contractors to develop the skills. The third thing that we do is we provide opportunities. We provide zero cost, net zero renovating training to people in the construction trades so that people know how to build the clean buildings that we're building and that increasingly are going to be required. We actively recruit non-traditional applicants. So example for the TTC, if you've noticed, if you're paying attention, who's driving the bus now? When I grew up, it was always white men. Who is it now? More and more it's women, it's people from all around the world, non-traditional backgrounds of every kind. We talked about EVs. In the downtown, cars are the wrong answer, no matter what kind of car it is. The answer is foot, transit, and two wheels. So one of the key things we're doing is, bike sharing is enormously important, but also just learning how to take care of a bike, being a bike mechanic, being a bike delivery person. So Bike Chain, for example, has free classes in how to learn to repair and support a bike. We've got Building Up, the nonprofit builder, which has a pre-apprenticeship program. So for people, especially the most vulnerable people who want to get into green trades, that's one of the ways to doing that. And then, of course, the astonishing variety of services provided by our public libraries. And then fourth and finally, we have a very limited ability to provide income support. We do that through Toronto Community Housing, which I'm working to upgrade the buildings. We have the $5 pass for bike share. If you don't know about this, the cheapest way to get around in the city by 100 miles is bike share. Anybody can pay over 3 months, so if you don't have $100 all at once, you can pay for it. But if you are a low-income, subsidized tenant of Toronto Community Housing, or you're getting a Fair Pass, you can have membership for unlimited rides on bike share all year round for $5. That's damn near free. That is a huge thing we've done for inequality. And of course, as we build out the bike share stations across the city, by the end of this year, they'll be available in every ward. And you also need the bike lanes to go with them. And we can talk about poverty advocates making that hard, but anyway. And then we also have a grant program coming later this year to help low-income families buy some of the equipment that we need. So we are doing a lot, but the poverty activists, the inequality activists do not show up at City Council to support these. If you want them, you need to show up. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant points there. Phil, 30 seconds, final words on solutions.
Sure, I'll be short and sweet. 2 things to speed up the energy transition. Number 1 is to fight misinformation. There's just too much misinformation. There's too much just false narratives out there. We need to educate people about why this matters and what to do. And number 2, we have to vote for leaders like Dianne who are going to actually work for climate action and care about it. I mean, I just heard the most inspiring, passionate appeal to all of you from a community leader locally, and we need to vote more people like Dianne into office. Because
don't vote for conservatives.
I'm not going to go that far. I think there have probably been maybe 1 or 2 conservatives in the history of this federation that probably did 1 or 2 good things. Acid rain mitigation was a conservative thing at one point. Let's not be too ideological. But all is to say, we
only vote for old conservatives.
Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. All is to say, those are the 2 things: stop misinformation and vote for people who will actually enact the policies to make a difference.
And there's an election coming, folks. There's a chance to work for the things you care about. If you don't show up, don't complain after.
Yeah, so that's on engagement, and you will be given the closing keynote. Maybe time to plug on that one. Serena, final points on solutions.
Yeah, there's a few things. First one, I love what you were bringing up. Energy efficiency is a vital step to the transition. I think energy efficiency is the pinnacle of a just transition. And I think this one, because I got a question one time of, okay, critical minerals, what do we do? Okay, well, let's use less energy, right? And it's as simple as looking at energy efficiency and looking at low carbon technologies, as well as just changing our cultural patterns of how much we're actually consuming. And then I also think I've worked on projects where they're like millions of dollars in revenue, and what I think about, like, a lot of communities, like, where's that money going? Because they don't actually know, and who, like, is making these decisions? Who is this transition for? Energy efficiency, it's cost savings. It's not necessarily making profit, and so you can't always have that argument around profit over people, which I think just makes my life a whole lot easier when implementing. So that would be my first thing, is that's essential. And my second thing, as we have a city councillor and we have a lot of people locally, we need to, and it kind of goes with a lot of these questions that have been asked, we need to make sure our solutions are local, are municipal, are community-led. And I think about this all the time, is we are supposed to go and make these decisions that we all depend on. But how many people even are talking to their neighbors and like talking next door, and they don't know how to actually build relationships? So one, we need to learn how to build relationships again, and we need to learn how to create communities of care for each other. And then two, we need to work together on the ground, because we need eco-localization. We're obviously seeing that the province doesn't represent us. The feds are a mess right now. And so who can you depend on? Well, we can depend on everyone coming into these shared spaces and really look forward, okay, like, let's build a future together. And then my last thing, I think, is we as Indigenous peoples, we're not scary. We don't want to leave anyone behind. And I think that's the thing, is we are leading this transition. So I'm talking about relationships, like, let's build partnerships and create reciprocal relations that can also benefit everyone. And I think, like, you want to do a project. We had the feed-in tariff program in Ontario. Six Nations only got its clean energy portfolio because of the feed-in tariff program, which was taken out through the Ford government. But see, and one of those pinnacles of when they were doing I'm blanking on my head, the call out for partners and the call out for the grid. And they literally had an Aboriginal check. You needed to have an Indigenous partnership to be able to push your project forward. And so how are we utilizing those spaces, and where are we starting? And I think, again, just really thinking about who is benefiting from this, right? And if it's around profit, then you obviously know that we have many gaps and it's not reaching everyone. So thank you.
Fantastic panel. A round of applause for this brilliant panel members here. And maybe a round of applause for yourselves for waiting and your patience. But thank you so much. We've got gifts for the panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights as well. So on behalf of the organizing committee, we will be, okay, it's a lot in my hands right now. So I'm gonna, okay, so here we go.
Okay.
And that's for
Thank you very much. My staff will be pleased. I think this is under the limit.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I mean, unless these are very, very expensive.
They're local, handcrafted in Toronto. There you go.
All right, folks, we've come to the end of this one. Thank you, I guess. and wrap up. I would enjoin you to take your seats as we welcome again Dr. Dianne Saxe to the podium here for the closing keynote. I wouldn't bore you with well, it's not bore actually. She actually doesn't want me to reread a bio, but you know, we know how fantastic she is. If we had a day, she would keep talking to us in a day. But we welcome Councillor Dianne Saxe over here for the closing keynote remarks.
Well, it's not a keynote. I'm just saying thank you. So I got a long list of thank yous. First of all, thank you to everybody who came today or came online to the Walter Gordon Symposium of 2025. And to those of you who stayed until the very end, you get extra points. It was a really interesting conversation. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here this morning, but I've heard very good things about it. And the Massey College has a long, long history of hosting valuable conversations across all kinds of lines, which can help create thought leadership going forward. So thank you all for being part of this. I have to thank all the panelists, but fortunately they didn't give me the names of all the panelists, so I don't have to read all of those. Thank you, though, to the Junior Fellow Organizing Committee for putting all this together, Massey College, the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and particularly Dr. Thomas Axworthy, David Slowly, Professor Carolyn, oh dear, I'm not sure I pronounce it, Tui? All right, they didn't tell me that. And the key members of staff at Massey College who contributed to the event's success, and also the folks who put together the food at lunch. Thank you very much for everybody on my panel. It was definitely the best panel of the day, right? Okay, I think the rest of it you've sort of got. I really just did want to say these are some of the most difficult issues that we deal with. There are no simple answers, but at least talking about them is useful and important. And as we go into a time of disruption and pain, because we know this is going to be a time of great economic pain, and we were already in a very difficult time with 1/10 of the population of the city dependent on food banks and more people frightened, mortgage renewals coming up. I mean, this is a really tough time for many people anyway, and now we have Trump on top of it. So this is going to be hard. And about the only recipe we have, I think, for hope, when I say it for climate, it's true for everything else. We have to start with knowledge, but then we need action with others. It's the only formula I know. Let's find a way to do it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Councillor Saxe. Well, yeah, but you thanked everyone I wanted to thank as well. So please, can everyone give a round of applause for yourselves and all the people who made the symposium possible today. So, 2 final points before we close. First thing, thank you all for joining today. If you wish to return to these conversations throughout the day, we have the amazing Joe Costa, who's been live streaming and recording these panels, so you can go and find the videos to maybe reflect on these conversations again on the Massey YouTube page. And in order to take us home to end the symposium, please join me in welcoming Thomas Axworthy to give us some few closing remarks or closing words.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dianne has already given us a long list of thanks, so I won't repeat that, except to say again that the junior fellows and the students at Monk have done just an exceptional job. With the Walter Gordon Symposium, it is the students who pick the topic, who organize the speakers, who put the panels together, who moderate them. So here at Massey College and at the Monk School, we hope that we are contributing to helping to train and encourage the leaders of the future. And this kind of symposium is one of those learning steps to bring together different minds and different perspectives and to try to think through the problems facing our society. So the students have done an absolutely first-class and wonderful job, and we are very much in your debt. The second thing I wanted to say is this has been a day where we have grappled with serious issues and there is an overarching theme different from past Gordon symposiums, which is that as we meet, the very existence of our country is being threatened by a superpower president. I don't say our friends to the south anymore. I call them our neighbors, because under this president, they are no longer friends. And the Gordon Symposium, to bring a note of history, Dianne talked about old conservatives and members of a past political class, but Walter Gordon was a minister of finance who, when we talk about equity, was the leading proponent at the time of Medicare, the Canada Pension Plan, the Canada Assistance Plan, to do in his time to try to make Canada a more equitable place for all our citizens. He was also, he had many companions in that effort, Tommy Douglas, David Kroll, many others, in that long parade of progressives to make this a more socially just country. But in one area, he was an initiator. He stood out by himself initially, and that he was the first modern politician, post-war politician, to warn Canada about that we were putting ourselves at risk, that we were becoming vulnerable by our overwhelming dependence on the United States in the economy, in defense, and in foreign policy. Mr. Gordon stood for an independent Canada that would make its own decisions for its own people and contribute to a different kind of world with the value system that we cherish. And in both those fronts, that Mr. Gordon, who funded this symposium, put together funds so that student minds would continue to grapple with the problems that he and his generation grappled with in the 1960s, becoming also a senior fellow at Massey College. He wanted the kind of exploration and dialogue that he stood for to continue in future generations. And I think he would be very, very pleased, delighted by the discussions that were being held in his name today. And lastly, I want to end where James Orbinski began this morning. And I'm so delighted with our students who took a theme of equity and how it applies in our society today as the major element to be examined through immigration, through migration policy, housing and urban affairs, and we've just had a terrific panel on energy transition. Equity running through the themes of these major public policies. But it was particularly important to have that equity theme because, as James said this morning, the very concept of equity, the very value of equity is now under assault. It's not just a question that we're not achieving it. There are many, many powerful players who no longer believe in it, who instead forthrightly advocate a dog-eat-dog world, who relish selfishness, not sharing, who want to reduce human relations to a market proposition in every regard. Equity as a value, one we have cherished at least since the 17th century, is under assault like never before in my lifetime. It used to be assumed that we all believe in this, though we may fail in achieving it. Understand, we're going backwards where there are powerful, powerful forces who are against the very idea. We're back to Darwinism in social and political policy. So, that doesn't mean that they're going to win, but it does mean we have to recognize what a strong and powerful set of forces are against the very values that we have tried to elucidate today. So Massey's mission is with civility and creativity to try to encourage public education that further the public good. Our students at Massey and Monk have done that today by reminding us how critical equity is, fair treatment, fairness, a value to be cherished, a value to be defended, and a value to be attained. Thank you very much.